Alright, how is colorblindness like Darwin and his cousin? Sex-linked, because Darwin married his... You know what? Never mind. Today on Chromophobe, we're going to be talking about the genetics of colorblindness. Now, if you don't know the difference between your protans and your deutans, you might want to take the opportunity to first watch this video on the types of colorblindness, or this one might get a little confusing. So color vision defects can be acquired or they can be congenital, meaning that they're existing at birth. And congenital color defects are genetic and they account for about 99% of all color blindnesses, though depending on how you define it, could be down to 90. Understanding the genetics of color blindness is the key to understanding how color deficiencies are inherited, why there are different severities of color blindness, and even what the eventual cure to color blindness is going to look like. This video is also going to start with some Genetics 101. So if you're already familiar with the basics of genetics, you can use the chapters in the playback bar to skip ahead over the parts that you already know. But if you do that, you'll be missing all of my amazing jokes and me guinea pigging my wife again. So you have got billions of cells in your body, and each one of those cells contains a copy of your genome. Your genome comprises several thousand genes, and each one of those genes is written with DNA. Now you can think of your genome as a cookbook, where each specific gene is a recipe that is telling you how to make a dish, aka a protein. So you might know protein as the stuff you put in a milkshake to get all swole, or in my case, cure a hangover. But proteins are actually all of the molecular functional machines in our body that pretty much do everything that our body needs doing. While a protein shake contains just a handful of different proteins, your body contains up to a few 100,000 types of proteins, 4 of which are your opsons, aka the proteins in your eye that make you see. Without the recipes though, you cannot make those proteins because you are not Jamie Oliver. Dear Jamie Oliver, if you let me interview you for my episode on colorblind cooking, I will promise not to mention your children's names, despite being super curious why a colorblind guy would name his daughter Rainbow. Sincerely, Protan. So your body needs these recipes, but what happens if those recipes are missing, or if they're altered, more likely? Well, just imagine how your cake would taste if all your sugar was substituted with boogers. Yum. Those typos are called mutations, and each mutation leads to a different variant of the recipe, and those variants are called the alleles of the gene. Sometimes the typo leads to an even better recipe, and this starts to cause evolution. But usually the typo is not wanted and just kind of leads to some inedible, crappy food, and this crappy food is exactly what causes congenital color blindness. For example, as a protan, my recipe for the L-opsin was amended, and the result is a dish that is not really functional or edible. So how did my L-opsin get mutated? Well, if the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are to be believed, it's because I, as a baby, got covered in an alien ooze from a race of Ootrons. You know, I was always more of a Power Rangers fan myself, and don't get me wrong, Ninja Turtles are way cooler than Power Rangers, but at least the makers of the Power Rangers knew how to choose colors that colorblind kids could tell apart. Anyway, in rare cases, you can have a spontaneous mutation and introduce a typo into one of your recipes. However, more often than not, the spontaneous mutation happened in one of your ancestors and was passed down to you through your parents. Each person actually has 2 cookbooks, and each one of those cookbooks is inherited from one of their parents. The cookbooks are actually about 99.9% similar, but those small differences mean that about 1 in 20 recipes has a different variant between those cookbooks. Having all these different alleles in our cookbooks is actually what makes humans similar but distinct from each other. We're not clones because we have variations of our recipes. So you have 2 cookbooks, and let's say you want to make a carrot cake. So you pull out a carrot cake recipe from mom's book, pull out the carrot cake recipe from dad's book, make them both, mix them together, and eat it. What happens? Well, this is where dominant and recessive alleles comes into play. First, if you have 2 yummy variants of the carrot cake recipe, you mix them together and make a yummy carrot cake. Second, let's say that both cookbooks contain a variant of the carrot cake recipe where all of the sugar has been replaced with oatmeal. So you make both of those sugar-free recipes, you mix them together, and what you have is a carrot loaf, or what your grandfather would probably say all vegan food tastes like. Both of these carrot cakes are homozygous because both cookbooks contained the same variant of the carrot cake recipe. On the other hand, When the two cookbooks contain different variants of the same gene, it is heterozygous. What happens then? Well, let's ask my wife, because I actually made both of these carrot cake alleles and had her taste them. So one of the recipes was a normal carrot cake recipe, and the other was a recipe where all of the sugar had been replaced by oatmeal. I made 2 homozygous cakes with each one of those recipes, and then I made a third heterozygous cake, which was an even mixture of the 2 batters. I asked my wife not to rate which one that she liked better, but to rate which one she thought more resembled carrot cake. The first homozygous yummy cake gets a 7 out of 10, which honestly it hurt a little bit, but you know what, my cooking skills aren't what's on trial here. I'm no Jamie Oliver. The second cake is the heterozygous one, the mixture of the 2 recipes. And she likes it. She actually thinks that it tastes more like carrot cake than the original, giving it an 8. The third cake is another homozygous cake that is completely sugar-free, and she gives that one a 2. She gives me two big thumbs down as she spits it out all over the remaining yummy cakes. When the heterozygous gene resembles more the normal yummy allele and less the sugar-free yucky allele, we say that the yummy allele is dominant and the yucky allele with no sugar and all oats is recessive. Let's change the mutation so that instead of replacing sugar with oats, it replaces sugar with fish. Now in this case, whether your end result is half fish or full fish, it's going to taste pretty nasty, and therefore the heterozygous mixture is going to resemble the mutated allele more than the yummy allele. Now in this case, we say that the yummy allele is now recessive and the mutant allele is now dominant. A dominant allele is always going to overshadow a recessive allele. So in order for a recessive allele to express itself, to show itself in the body, you need to have that recessive allele in both cookbooks. So let's come back to colorblindness for a second. And I know I've shown this clip in a previous video, but I love it.
Colorblindness works. It carries down through the male gene.
And I find it so sad that ProGamerJ took down this video and this was the only part that I saved because there were so many gems in there. So what ProGamerJ is trying to say is correct, because like I said at the beginning of this video, 99% of color blindnesses are red-green color blindness, and those types are sex-linked. And I certainly don't mean that my lower color perception helps me with the ladies.
Well, it sure helps me with the ladies.
Oh, is that why you never got married, Dalton? No, sex-linked just means that a certain allele will affect men and women to different degrees, and this is exactly how sex works in mammals. And you and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals. Anyway, this is where chromosomes come into play, and just an aside, I always thought that chromosome was a really great name for color blindness because, you know, we're not blind to color. We see some color. It's way better. Anyway, to carry on with the cookbook analogy, the chromosomes are the chapters. Each one of the cookbooks has 23 chapters, and the first are labeled 1 to 22 and are called the autosomes. The final chapter is either X or Y, where those chapters actually contain completely separate recipes from one another. So if you have chapter X in both of your chromosomes, you are a female. If you have one of each chapter in your cookbooks, you are a male. And if you have 2 Y chapters in your cookbook, then you have 2 biological daddies. Impressive and impossible, because that X chromosome has some pretty crucial recipes in it for survival. Like pizza! So if you're a female with 2 X chromosomes, all of the recessive and dominant alleles work exactly the same as they do in the autosomes because you have 2 copies of every recipe in the cookbook. However, males only have 1 copy of each recipe that are on the X and Y chromosome. If there is a mutation on the Y chromosome, then only males are affected because females neither have nor need anything on that chromosome. But if the mutant allele is on the X chromosome, it will affect both males and females, just to different degrees. Recessive alleles will affect males more than females. Essentially, males only have the 1 copy of the recipe, so if it is mutated to not have sugar, their final cake will also not have sugar, whereas females have 2 chances of getting some sugar in their cake. On the other hand, dominant alleles affect females more than they affect males. That's because males only have 1 copy of the X chapter, and so they only have to avoid the fishy allele once in order to make a yummy cake. Whereas females have both X recipes, so they have to avoid the fishy allele twice to make a cake that doesn't taste like sardines. Now, finally, let's get into the color blindness. I'm only going to be talking about red-green color blindnesses today because that makes up 99% of CVD, and also the genetics work significantly different from everything else. First, there is no colorblind gene. The genes in question hold recipes for the L and M opsins, which are the proteins that catch the light photons in your retina. Now, color blindness arises as a phenotype or a trait or a symptom when one of those genes is mutated to a point where it is dysfunctional and can no longer catch like it's supposed to. Now, you probably already know that color blindness affects males much more than females, so using that information and what we learned in the first part of this video, you can probably determine where on this chart color blindness falls. I feel like Dora the Explorer. That's right, muy bien, fantástico! Both of the genes for the L and M opsins are located on the X chromosome and therefore are sex-linked. As well, any mutated allele of either one of those genes is recessive because a mutated protein is harmless and your body only needs one good recipe in order to make the opsins that it needs. Therefore, just like the heart-wrenching 1993 movie Rudy, color blindness is much more likely to affect males than females. Males only have one chance to draw a recipe with sugar, whereas females have two chances. So I'm going to make a brief tangent into some math, and don't worry, it's only going to last 30 seconds, and I really hope I do not see a drop in my viewer retention at this timestamp. So about 8% of Caucasian males are colorblind, because when they are picking their single X chromosome out of the gene pool, that chromosome has an 8% chance of carrying a color vision deficiency with it. Contrarily, females have to draw two X chromosomes in a row, and to be colorblind, each one of those X chromosomes would have to have the recessive color vision deficiency on it. So if you remember your probability module from high school with pulling colored marbles out of a bag and flipping coins, you might remember that if you want to flip a coin twice and receive heads both times, the odds of that happening are 50% to the power of 2. The same thing is happening here. When you're pulling those two X chromosomes, if you have an 8% chance of one being defective, you need both of them to be defective for the female to exhibit color blindness, then the chances of a female being colorblind should be 8% times 8%, or 0.64%. In reality, about 0.55% of females are colorblind, which is pretty damn close to my very, very rough prediction. And this is exactly why colorblind conventions are so sad. It's not because none of us see color, but simply because it's a giant sausage fest. Alright, so the colorblind mutations are both sex-linked and they are recessive. Using those two pieces of information, we can start to explain how the heredity of these mutations works, i.e. how they pass down through the family tree. Before we get started, a bit of a legend for how these graphics are going to work. So each individual in the family trees is going to be shown with their sex chromosomes. Y will always be black. X will only be black if it has no color vision deficiency on it, and the X will be colored if there is a colorblind allele on it. It's ironic, I know. Color normal individuals will have a white fill with a solid border, whereas colorblind individuals will have a colored fill with a broken border. And yes, I know how problematic it is to depict males and females with pants and dresses, but if you can come up with a better way, let me know. Otherwise, let's get started. So a male having the XY karyotype can only have received the Y chromosome from his father, and therefore must have received the X chromosome from his mother. Because the opsin genes are only located on the X chromosome, a male can only inherit a colorblind allele from his mother, never from his father. If that male's father or anyone on his paternal side of the family is colorblind, that is purely a coincidence. But despite the male inheriting colorblindness through his mother, the mother herself will usually not be colorblind. And that's because she will be heterozygous, having one colorblind allele and one color normal allele. 15% of females are these so-called carriers because while they have color normal vision themselves, they also have a 50% chance of passing on that colorblind allele to each one of their children. Because females inherit an X chromosome from each one of their parents, as a carrier, she could have received the colorblind allele from either her mother or her father. If her father was colorblind, then he must pass that colorblind allele on to his daughter. However, if her father was not colorblind, then the colorblind allele would have come from her mother, who either would have had to have been a carrier or even colorblind herself. Colorblind males must have a mother who is at least a carrier, therefore there is at least a 50% chance that that male's maternal grandfather is also colorblind. So guys, if your grandpa's still around, ask him about your color vision. Have him take a test on your phone. Have him try on your chroma glasses. If he does have color blindness, then it is almost guaranteed to be the same type and severity as your own. You may be able to bond over something other than grandma's carrot cake. My maternal grandfather was actually colorblind, and he refused to admit it, so we never bonded. But yeah, while we're on the subject, let's talk a little bit more about my personal situation. Because as a colorblind dad, every one of my daughters will be a carrier, whereas none of my sons will be colorblind. And just to note that definitely not having 4 kids, this is purely hypothetical. Now these odds assume that my wife is not a carrier for color blindness, which, taking into account that neither of her parents are colorblind, there is still an 8% chance that she is a carrier. And in that case, 50% of all of our children will be colorblind. Now let's turn the scope over to females, because they don't entirely come out of the gene pool unscathed. In fact, there's nothing a girl with CVD hates more than being told that they can't be colorblind because it only affects boys. For females to be colorblind, they have to inherit a colorblind allele from both of their parents. This means that their father must be colorblind and their mother must at least be a carrier or be colorblind herself. A colorblind female will have all colorblind sons, and assuming that her husband or baby daddy is not colorblind himself, all of her daughters will be carriers. If her baby daddy is also colorblind, then all of their children will be colorblind. And I just gotta say, that looks like a really fun family board game night. But I have to admit, all of these family trees have been a little bit oversimplified. Recall that the actual prevalence of color blindness in females was a little bit lower than I had predicted with my 8% times 8% calculation. Part of the overprediction is that we've been assuming a female will be colorblind if she has any 2 colorblind alleles, which is not true. For example, if a female has 2 types of colorblindness alleles, one protan allele that is mutating her L cone and one deuteran allele that is mutating her M cone, then she will still be color normal because she still has a healthy recipe for each one of those opsin proteins. Despite her being color normal, 100% of her sons will be colorblind, and that's before we even get into the genetic recombination in her gametes causing blue cone monochromacies. And we're not gonna mention that because look at that time. It's time to move on. I will reward you for all of that learning by telling you about the cure for color blindness, which exists. Kinda. By now, I think it should be clear that if we want to cure color blindness, we're gonna have to do something a little bit more drastic than in chroma glasses and start taking a closer look at the genes. For the past 1.2 billion years, humans and our ancestors have been stuck with the genes that we were born with. But in the last 20 years, methods have come to light called gene therapy that allow us to enter a new and revised copy of a recipe into one of our cookbooks. Essentially, you take a virus, you deactivate some of the more dangerous parts of its genome, and then you add a human gene of, for example, a functional opsin that an individual is otherwise missing. You then inject these viruses into your retina, and those viruses in turn inject their genome into your cells, including the gene for a functional human opsin. Your body should then be able to read these new recipes and in theory build new cones that express this new opsin, which would allow the individual to then see with a wider color gamut than they were born with. In theory, because technically this has never been tried on humans with red-green color blindness. Trials on squirrel monkeys in 2009 injected human L-opsin into the retina of dichromatic squirrel monkeys and effectively cured them, giving them functional trichromacy. But despite the fantastic success of this trial, it's never really gone anywhere because a few years later, chroma glasses came out and researchers thought, oh, they look happy enough. Let's do something else. But hope is not lost because since 2018, a number of trials have been ongoing which are applying gene therapy to a mutation that causes a much rarer and more severe form of color blindness called achromatopsia. And the results are pretty positive. I can imagine that it's only going to be 15 or 20 years before they extend that gene therapy and apply it to humans with a red-green color blindness. Of course, I'm going to be 50 at that point, which is old enough that change will scare me, and I'm not going to bother. As you can see by the fact that I have never had either contacts nor LASIK, you can imagine that I'm not going to want a needle in my eyeball. Things are moving really fast in that field, and there's a lot more to dive into, but this is enough for this video. Please do all that likey, subscribey, commenty business, and I will see you next time for a way simpler topic. This is Chromophobe.